I've been hearing the word existential a lot lately in phrases like existential threat, existential question, and existential crisis. So I thought it would be a good idea to devote an episode to this word that's deep, a bit heavy, but super interesting and most importantly necessary for us to know. Existential, it's a word that's about our very existence, so it's not a bad idea to arm ourselves with some knowledge about it. But before we get started, do subscribe to The English Nut on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X. Thank you. Our story starts with some brainy folks a while back thinking hard about life and why we're here. Existential comes from fancy talk meaning existing, and it got really popular with thinkers who were all about asking, what's the point of me? Here are some example sentences that will help you better understand the word. His existential musings often led him to discuss the purpose of life with anyone who would listen. She found herself reading existential literature, seeking answers about human existence. The documentary explored existential themes, questioning the core of human nature and our place in the universe. Big names in the existential game like French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre and Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard were obsessed with how weird it is just being alive. They thought about how freaky it is that we have to make choices that really matter in a world that doesn't hand us a rule book. But hey, it's not just for the philosophy crowd. Existential pops up when we talk about big, scary stuff like climate change or tech going wild. It's about the big challenges that make us question if we'll keep going as we are. An existential question is a deep, thought-provoking question about the fundamental aspects of our human existence. These questions often focus on the big issues like the meaning of life, our purpose, or why we experience things like suffering and joy. They're the kind of questions that could keep you up at night, pondering the meaning of life. Here are a couple of example sentences that will help you understand the phrase existential question better. Why are we here is perhaps the most classic existential question that has puzzled philosophers for centuries. The existential question of whether there is life after death continues to be a topic of both scientific and philosophical debate. To be or not to be, that is the question. Sounds familiar, right? Old Hamlet was onto something. It's about figuring out if the struggle, the pain, and the joy of life are worth it. That's pretty existential, don't you think? Though, of course, Hamlet was written way before existentialism was officially a thing. When something's an existential threat, it's so big it could change everything we know. So what are the existential threats facing us today? They are things that could fundamentally alter our way of life or even threaten our survival on this planet. Climate change is perhaps the most talked about existential threat. It's not just about warmer summers or chillier winters. We're talking about severe weather patterns that could disrupt millions of lives, lead to species extinction, and turn our planet into a wasteland. Then there's artificial intelligence. As much as it helps us, there's a real conversation about AI potentially becoming too smart, where it stops being a tool in our hands and starts controlling us. And we can't forget the risks of nuclear war and global pandemics. As we know from our own experience with COVID and our study of history, these dangers aren't just plot points in a thriller movie. Every one of us has a part to play in dealing with existential threats, whether it's reducing our carbon footprint, staying informed and engaged with global policies, or simply spreading awareness and pushing for change. It's about turning our existential angst into action. And here is how you can use the phrase existential threat in a sentence. The rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria represents an existential threat to global health. And before we close the book today, let's touch on something you might have heard about, the existential crisis. Ever feel like you're suddenly questioning everything? Your course of study, your job, your choices, what you're doing with your life? That's an existential crisis. It usually hits when something big changes or when life doesn't seem to make sense anymore. Maybe it's a birthday that ends in 0, a big loss, or a random Tuesday when you're just feeling stuck. Here are 2 example sentences to help you understand the meaning of existential crisis better. After losing his job, he went through an existential crisis, questioning his life's direction and purpose. Turning 30 sparked an existential crisis in her, making her reassess her personal and professional life. If you ever find yourself in the midst of an existential crisis, remember it's okay to ask for help, whether it's talking to friends or seeking out a therapist. So what's the takeaway? Well, those existential thinkers tell us to own our choices, make our lives mean something, and not freak out over the scary stuff. It's about finding your own path and sticking to it, even when things get rough. Think of existential not as a downer, but as a kick in the butt that reminds us to get out there and really live. In the big, wild, weird journey of life, it's the choices we make that define us. Choices like deepening our understanding of the world through language, through important words like existential. Do let me know your thoughts in the comments section. I'm the English Nut. Bye for now.